What's the wisest part of the Constitution? James Madison's take is probably a surprise to many people. So today I'm going to share with you what that is and why the father of the Constitution said that this clause was where the most wisdom is to be found in the Constitution. And well, what shouldn't be surprising is that his view is not only totally forgotten and ignored today, but the clause itself has been twisted, flipped upside down into exactly what James Madison warned against. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, September 16th, 2024. Thank you so much for being here. But let's kick it off right away, and I'm going to just spill the beans right off the bat here with Madison's take. And here he is writing as Helvidius in his fourth essay, 1793. He said, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department. Beside the objection to such a mixture of heterogeneous powers, the trust and temptation would be too great for any one man, not such as nature may offer as the prodigy of many centuries, but such as may be expected in the ordinary successions of magistracy." Magistracy. Madison said you can't mix the powers and you can't give too much power to a single dude. And he reiterated this a few years later in Political Observations 4/20/1795. He said, "The Constitution expressly and exclusively vests in the legislature the power of declaring a state of war. It was proposed," he's talking about a session of Congress, he said it was proposed that the executive might, in the recess of the legislature, declare the United States to be in a state of war. So in other words, it was proposed all the way back in the 1790s that the executive in certain situations for a temporary time might be able to say that they are in a state of war and then command the troops and the military as such afterwards. But he said a delegation of such powers would have struck not only at the fabric of our Constitution, but at the foundation of all well-organized and well-checked governments. Man, James Madison was really hammering home on separation of powers. In fact, he was so on board with the idea of separation of powers that he called it a dogmatic maxim in the entire system. And he expressly included it in his proposal for amendments, which became the Bill of Rights. He originally wanted amendments in the body of the Constitution. He included a separation of powers doctrine as the 16th of his proposed amendments, which have ended up as the Bill of Rights. I did an episode on that a couple of years ago, the other 16th Amendment, separation of powers, that I think is a pretty important episode. But I'm just going to skip over that, just mention it briefly right now. But back to James Madison again in his observations. He points out that, and he keeps hammering this over the years, that in warfare, the power of the executive just expands and expands and expands. That's just the nature of things. That's how things always have played out. That's how we should always expect them to play out. That's why you don't want that one person making that decision, because they may make the decision in order to expand their own power. And we know that it is a maxim of human nature that power always seeks to expand. So if you give people additional opportunity, certainly they're going to run with it. And here's how Madison put it. He said, "In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied. And all the means of seducing," I like how he put that, "seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people." Of course, he continued this by pointing out that no nation, not one, not just those over there, not just here and there, but every nation, no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And he said these are long-held truths. These are things that you have observed all through history. They're in 1795, and I think they've played out pretty much that way ever since. He said those truths are well established. They are read in every page which records the progression from a less arbitrary to a more arbitrary government. Keep in mind, arbitrary power is power exercised on a whim. If you give government limits and you say you can only do these things, and then it goes beyond those limits, that's an exercise of arbitrary power. It was listed as one of the grievances, the injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence. That's how the founding generation defined tyranny, was a government that could do just whatever the heck it wants. Kind of like a living, breathing constitution approach. He said, those truths are well established. They are read in every page which records the progression from a less arbitrary to a more arbitrary government. So I guess from a less tyrannical one to a much worse one. Or the transition from a popular government, a government of the people, to an aristocracy or a monarchy. That is, again, in Political Observations in 1795. He continued this same kind of thoughts a few years earlier, again, in Helvidius number 4. He said, war is, in fact, the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. He understood that executive power would expand, and this was the problem. Of course, they fought a long, bloody war to secede from a system where just a handful of people or a single person could exercise almost unlimited power, or as in the king in parliament, the British claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So this is unlimited power. He said, in war, a physical force is to be created, and it is the executive will which is to direct it. In war, the public treasures are to be unlocked, and it is the executive hand which is to dispense them. In war, the honors and emoluments of office are to be multiplied, and it is the executive patronage under which they are to be enjoyed. You see this same kind of thought process 2 years later, again, as I just mentioned a minute ago. And then he continued. He said, it is in war, finally, that laurels are to be gathered, and it is the executive brow they are to encircle. The strongest passions and most dangerous weaknesses of the human breast. Again, he's talking about human nature, recognizing what humanity does. We're all flawed creatures. I wouldn't trust me with power over war and peace. Certainly, I'm a pretty trustworthy guy. He said, ambition, avarice, vanity, the honorable or venial love of fame are all in conspiracy against the desire and duty of peace. And he continued, he explained why. This is the reason why. He said the separation of the power of declaring war from that of conducting it is wisely contrived to exclude the danger of its being declared for the sake of its being conducted. In other words, just the TLDR. If you give someone all this power and then in warfare, that executive power expands in all these various ways that he explained, then of course you're going to find situations where that person is going to decide that the country is going to wage war with just for the sake of doing it. What a surprise. What a surprise. Mike Meharry put it like this, and we published this article just yesterday on Madison and war powers and how he actually used them while president in office for his 2 terms. Very interesting stuff here. He said in Helvidius paper number 1, this is also in 1793, Madison, he said, emphasized that from a constitutional standpoint, all legislative authority is vested in Congress. And this logically included the power to change the state of things from peace to war. Legislative power is with the legislature. Executive power is with the executive branch. And when the executive does things like, legislating through executive orders with a pen, they're doing stuff, they're violating the rules of the separation of powers. And then also, if they're declaring war, and we'll get to what that means in just a moment, they're also violating that essential principle. And he said it like this: in the general distribution of powers, we find that of declaring war expressly vested in the Congress. It's spelled out there in Article 1, Section 8, where every other legislative power is declared to be vested. And of course, it follows that, as Madison put it, the constitutional idea of this power would seem then clearly to be that it is of a legislative and not an executive nature. So again, the power to declare war was sent to Congress, delegated to Congress by the people of the several states for a reason. Madison, of course, Mike points out, he argued that there is no presidential authority whatsoever to declare war because it is fundamentally a legislative function. The president's role is to execute laws, and as he explained, quote, a declaration that there shall be war is not an execution of laws. It does not suppose pre-existing laws to be executed. It is not in any respect an act merely executive. So the act of the decision to declare war is a legislative act. It is done by the representatives of the people and the representatives of the states. And in order to make that decision, it's up to them. And then the executive branch executes that war once basically he's told he's supposed to. Now back to Helvidius in his second paper. This is August 31st, 1793. He said, the declaring of war is expressly made a legislative function. Whenever then a question occurs whether war shall be declared or whether public stipulations require it, the question necessarily belongs to the department to which these functions belong. And no other department can be, and he highlights this in italics in the original as well, in the execution of its proper functions. In other words, as long as it's staying within its limits, if it's following the Constitution, they cannot go beyond this line. He said, if it should undertake to decide such a question. So no other department, the judiciary, the states can't do this. Of course, they're expressly prohibited in certain situations. The executive branch can't do this. So it's only a legislative function. Again, in Helvidius number 2, he reiterated this again in his third essay. He said, the power of the legislature to declare war and judge of the causes for declaring it is one of the most express and explicit parts of the Constitution. Again, he considered this division of powers over warfare to be the part where the most wisdom is to be found in the Constitution. And then he reiterates this again, pointing out that he said this is the most express, one of the most express and explicit parts of the Constitution. In other words, it's so clear as day, there should be no confusion over this whatsoever. He said to endeavor to abridge or affect it by strained inferences. That's what we hear all the time on everything today, right? Strained inferences and by hypothetical or singular occurrences naturally warns the reader of some lurking fallacy. So in other words, when they come out and say, well, what about this crazy situation? Madison's saying, be prepared. This is like a warning sign. This is a red flag that they're coming at you with a lie, with a fallacy, something that is not authorized by the Constitution as ratified by the people of the several states. That was in Helvidius number 3. And then back to number 4, he said, he called it a part of the fundamental doctrine of the Constitution. And I'm going to get to some explanation of the definitions of these terms. What is war? What is declare war in just a few minutes? He said, every just view that can be taken of this subject admonishes the public of the necessity of a rigid adherence to the simple, the received, and the fundamental doctrine of the Constitution. In other words, fundamental doctrine of the Constitution is that powers are delegated and reserved. The power to declare war, he said, including the power of judging the causes of war, is fully and exclusively vested in the legislature. It is never up to the executive branch. And he explains what the executive branch is authorized to do. We'll get to that in just a moment. And he continued with this, and he just hammered this home over and over and over. He said the executive has no right in any case to decide the question whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. Of course, the executive branch can ask Congress for this authority, for this authorization, for this declaration, but the executive branch can't do anything beyond that. And that's how he put it in Helvidius number 4. He said, the right of convening and informing Congress, whenever such a question seems to call for a decision, is all the right which the Constitution has deemed requisite or proper, and that for such more than for any other contingency, this right was specially given to the executive. So straightforward stuff. It's exclusively The decision of whether or not the country is going to wage war is exclusively in the hands of the legislature because they represent the people and they represent the people of the several states. They represent the states themselves, especially prior to the 17th Amendment, but that's a whole different episode, which I've done recently as well. And then all the executive branch can do is inform Congress of what's going on, convene Congress and say, here's what's happening. I'm asking you for permission is basically how it goes. And that's exactly what James Madison did, not only in the War of 1812, but also a war against Algiers, where he waited 2 years to request permission from Congress to wage war against Algiers, even though they had declared war against the United States. So I'll get to that in just a few minutes as well. So the TLDR, according to the father of the Constitution, again, only the legislature can declare war. That's Congress only. There is no case where the executive branch has this authority. There is no situation ever, in any case, is how he put it, where the president gets to make that decision, despite the fact that in almost every modern conflict, of course, they don't want us to think they're war, so therefore it doesn't qualify, but I'll get to that in a few minutes as well. Every single modern one, the decision has basically been in the executive branch. It's been flipped upside down completely. So the executive branch can only ask Congress to consider it, and then he has to follow what they make their decision to be. If they say, no, we're not going to do this, George Washington certainly asked for power, and then he wasn't given it. And so then he had to tell his people on the frontier, no, we only have to stay in defensive posture until I get approval from Congress. And then later on, he got approval from Congress and said, okay, now you can do this. Same thing with Jefferson, same thing with Adams. And now Madison is discussing this as well. But of course, this leaves a couple of questions. And I already hinted at this as well. What qualifies as war? Can we get away with saying, limited strikes or small conflicts or exchanges of violent volleys between militaries? Are those warfare? And what qualifies as a declaration of war? Does it have to be a specific statement saying we are declaring war against blank? I'm going to get to all that in just a minute, but first of all, I do want to mention that all of these reference links, the original source documents, etc., they will all be included in a blog post for this episode a couple of hours after this live stream is done. Alan Mosley does a really awesome job getting those organized. Of course, on every single blog post, again, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. He includes all the various platforms we're on. So if we happen to be missing from one someday, don't be surprised, but we happen to be missing from one, you'll find us on others. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and LinkedIn and X. We also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. We have the audio only podcast edition all over the place. And if we're not on a platform that you'd like to see us on, please do let me know, whether it's in the comments, especially in the archive, or you can email team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Again, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. But the most important thing that I'm trying to get to here is I'm just scratching the surface of the context of these original source documents from Madison. Of course, Meharry's article is like almost 3,000 words. This is really, really awesome history. Awesome stuff about the Constitution and how Madison viewed it and how he exercised those powers, how he looked at those limits of powers when he was president. Great examples for us to look to today. But that'll all be linked to in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I'm in a new studio this week as I moved last week, which is why I was not doing any shows. So I don't have the live chat app set up yet, but hopefully I'll get back to that in the next couple of episodes here. So I apologize for that. I do appreciate you guys all being here, whether it's live or in the archive. It's your first episode, or you've been here for every single one since day one. So let's get back to it. That question one, what qualifies as war? And Meharry discusses this in his article as well. He said, today, most people think only an all-out war, like a full-scale invasion against another country, counts as a war under the Constitution. In their view, smaller-scale military operations fall short of the war threshold. They're not defined as war. They're kinetic action, or I don't know, what are some of the other terms that they've used in the last few decades? Some kind of operation, various terms that they use, anything other than calling it a war. So therefore they can say, well, it's not a war. So then of course, Congress has to be the one that declares war, but this isn't it. So the executive branch can do whatever they want. And that's how they kind of get away with these kinds of things. So they say that these small scale military operations, some of them are large scale as well, fall short of the war threshold and therefore don't need congressional authorization. But he said, as constitutional scholar, longtime friend of the TAC, Rob Natelson has noted, the founders didn't make that distinction at all. And here's how Rob put it. He said, founding era dictionaries and other sources, he researched dozens and dozens and dozens of sources on this. He said, both legal and lay tell us that when the Constitution was approved, the word war consisted of any hostilities initiated by a sovereign over opposition. A very typical dictionary definition, and he takes one from Barlow's dictionary of 1772 to 1773, which is a very common one. I know a lot of people like to use Webster's dictionary of 1828, but words change over time. And Madison warned us about using modern definitions for a legal document ratified in the late 18th century. You really can't use any dictionary past, let's say, like 1791, when the Bill of Rights was ratified, for an understanding of the original legal meaning of the Constitution. That is because the word may have a different definition just a few years later, and that different definition could not be what the people of the several states accepted when they ratified the Constitution back when they did so. Anyways, so he said a very typical dictionary definition was, quote, the exercise of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. And Rob points out that in his research, he has found no suggestion in any contemporaneous source that operations of the kind the U.S. is conducting, he was talking about the Libya operations in 2011 in this article, were anything but war. So that's an important point. So any violence conducted by a sovereign command over opposition is considered war. Now, he points out that the founders favored authority on international law, Vattel, who I've covered in another episode as well, divided wars into three principal categories. There's defensive wars, offensive just wars, and offensive unjust wars. So I don't want to get into the details of this, but the short version is that a defensive war, according to the founders, according to the rules of international law that they followed, that they basically codified in the Constitution, they did not require a declaration. So if you're just repelling an invasion, then of course you don't need to go to Congress. You have to, this is self-defense. This is not an act of war. He said a just offensive war did require one, although it might be called something other than a declaration of war. It could be called, for example, an authorization to use military force. The problem with the modern AUMFs, though, just as a quick aside, is it's not Congress making the decision. They're saying, dear President, we are authorizing you to use military force against whomever you decide. So they're basically passing the buck. And maybe if you're really interested in some more detail on that type of information, maybe I can look through those in more detail and explain them. Let me know in the comments or send an email, and I'd be happy to do another episode on modern AUMFs versus real declarations of war. Now, you don't have to say this is a declaration of war because, according to the founders and basically everyone, an act of violence is if you start bombing a city, everyone knows that you are conducting warfare against that country. Anyways, back to Meharry. He said, in other words, when the president decides any question of war and peace, except for authorizing purely defensive actions, he acts outside his constitutional authority. The president only has the power to act after Congress provides explicit instructions. This is on offensive. This is warfare, not self-defense. Provides explicit instructions in the form of a formal declaration of war or authorization to take some kind of offensive military action. So offense requires Congress's approval, whether in a form of a official declaration or an authorization to use force. George Washington experienced or worked with the latter a bunch of times, Thomas Jefferson, so did John Adams. And again, we'll see a little bit more of that in just a moment. Once Congress acts, the president is limited to its instructions, he points out, whether Congress grants an open-ended authorization to wage war or a more limited offensive response. And in a minute, we're going to see how Madison put all this into practice as president in the early 1800s. Now, question number 2 is what qualifies as a declaration of war? Now, at the time the Constitution was ratified, the power to declare war was widely understood by basically everyone as changing the state of things from peace to war. And Mike points out that it's also important to note that a country can change the state of things from peace to war with a formal declaration, as I keep reiterating here, but it can also happen with the execution of military actions, however limited. And of course, the president, he said, doesn't have the constitutional authority to do either. So if someone attacks you, but doesn't issue some kind of paperwork to say that they're declaring war, they've still declared war in action and in deed. They are waging war against you. And Madison discussed this as president as well. Here's how Thomas Jefferson described it in a letter to Congress, December 6th, 1805. Of course, this will be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. He said, Congress alone is constitutionally invested with the power of changing our condition from peace to war. Congress alone can make that decision. And Meharry goes a little further with this, talking about James Madison. He said, in a special message to Congress in 1812, Madison enumerated, of course, in Meharry's article, he talks about kind of the ramp up to this war of 1812 with the British. Of course, they had been attacking U.S. ships for a number of years, including the Chesapeake, etc. But you can get more detail on this as well. Madison enumerated U.S. grievances against Britain. He asserted that impressments, blockades, and other aggressive measures amounted to a declaration of war against the United States. Now, Britain actually didn't issue, from my understanding, maybe someone else knows better than me, but from my understanding, at least the research that Mike has done as well, we're not aware of any formal declaration from Great Britain that said, Great Britain is now in a state of war against these United States. They just started attacking, doing these blockades, impressments, basically capturing people and forcing them into service on the seas. And Mike points out that even though the British had made no official pronouncement of war against the U.S., much less issued a formal declaration, President Madison believed their actions spoke louder than words. And here from his special message to Congress, this was on the foreign policy crisis, is how it's titled, June 1st, 1812. This is Madison requesting authorization, a declaration of war from Congress. This is the first formal one that used those terms there in 1812. And here's how Madison put it. We behold our seafaring citizens still the daily victims of lawless violence, committed on the great common and highway of nations, even within sight of the country which owes them protection. So, daily violence, lawless violence against our citizens. Some people today would say that doesn't count as war unless they've actually declared it. And so therefore, the executive magistracy of any country can do whatever the heck they want, especially under the Constitution. The United States can do whatever they want. Anyways, Madison continued, we behold our vessels freighted with the products of our soil and industry, or returning with the honest proceeds of them, wrested from their lawful destinations, confiscated by prize courts, no longer the organs of public law, but the instruments of arbitrary edicts, and their unfortunate crews dispersed and lost, or forced or inveigled, I've never actually seen that word other than here, in British ports into British fleets. I think he's talking about the impressment of what's going on here. They're basically kidnapping people and forcing them to serve for the British. He said, we behold in fine. Can you imagine if this was happening in modern times? If U.S. shipping was being attacked all over the world? If people were being kidnapped? Violence over and over daily, as Madison described it. Maybe he was hyping it up, but it was pretty common, actually. He said, we behold in fine. Now, this is the really key point that we're getting out of this. He's just kind of going through all this violence that's happening by the British against the United States. And then he says, well, they're at a state of war with us, but we're not still at a state of war with them until you give us permission to do so. That's how he tells it to Congress. We behold in fine, on the side of Great Britain, a state of war against the United States, and on the side of the United States, a state of peace towards Great Britain. Again, that means so much because so many people today, even if they really take our side in understanding the Constitution means that only Congress can declare war, and I actually made this error up until just a few years ago as well. The idea that only Congress can change the state of things from peace to war, the argument then would go, well, these other people attacked, so therefore they changed the state of things from peace to war. But the notion that Madison took here, the idea that the father of the Constitution took was, well, no, you in Congress have not declared war, and maybe the people and the states don't want to wage a full-scale war in response. Maybe you want to do something different. Maybe, whatever it may be, it's not up to the executive branch to make that decision. And I think that's really the big kicker, because even though James Madison explained that Great Britain was already waging war against the United States, they had been doing so on a daily basis, he still took the position that it was up to Congress to decide how they wanted to respond at all, or if they wanted to just stay on defense, or if they wanted to be passive, for example. And that's the term that he used as well. He said, whether the United States shall continue passive under these progressive usurpations and these accumulating wrongs, or opposing force to force in defense of their national rights, is a solemn question which the Constitution wisely confides to the legislative department of the government. And so he says, in recommending it to their early deliberations, I am happy in the assurance that the decision will be worthy the enlightened and patriotic counsels of a virtuous, a free, and a powerful nation. So again, despite ongoing attacks by the British against the United States, and they were happening for quite a long time, James Madison didn't take the position that he could call up the military and do whatever he wants and wage an all-out war in response. He said it still was up to Congress to make the decision of how they were going to deal with it, and whatever they decided, he was going to have to abide by. That's really different than how things are today. And of course, and this is kind of an important point, Meharry points out that Congress apparently agreed. They didn't send Madison a memo saying, hey, Mr. President, no worries, James, just do what you want, because the British had already informally declared war by their actions. Instead, Congress passed the first formal declaration of war in U.S. history as requested. And the declaration proclaimed this, that war be, and the same is hereby declared to exist between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and the dependencies thereof, and the United States of America and their territories. Now back to Helvidius number 1, he reiterated this same kind of a point. And this is how he did it in practice as president. So you can see how he was consistent on this. There was no flip-flopping here at all. He said, those who are to conduct a war cannot in the nature of things be proper or safe judges whether a war ought to be commenced, continued, or concluded. So to start fighting back, to continue fighting, or to end the fighting, these are all in the hands of the legislative department, of the people of the several states. Because if the people of the several states are the fountain of all power, and government is merely the agent of the people, if you have one dude making these decisions, one person making these decisions, that's totally opposite. The people are no longer in charge. They're on their knees, maybe hoping that the executive branch is going to do what they want to do. Now back to Mike Meharry again. He said, we're going to look at something else, because this was not the War of 1812 against the British was not the only time that Madison approached war powers under the Constitution in this manner. On July 25th, 1812, if you think about the timing of his special message to Congress requesting authorization, requesting a declaration of war from Congress, explaining that it was their decision to make if they wanted to be passive or if they wanted to be strong about it. The day of Algiers, that's the head boss in Algiers, July 25th, 1812. Now, we know that they were kind of working hand in hand with the British there, but they officially declared war on the United States, and they started attacking U.S. shipping, probably even more aggressively than they had been in the past, but they had captured another ship within just a matter of weeks. And Mike points out that occupied with the British, the U.S. didn't initially respond to the Algerian Declaration and subsequent aggression. But after the Treaty of Ghent ended the war with the British in December of 1814, Madison then turned his attention to Algiers. This is 2+ years later. It's 2.5 years. And by the time he actually requests authorization from Congress, he doesn't get a declaration of war. He gets an act that authorizes him to do a limited military response. But again, Madison felt that this was a decision that only Congress could make. And Mike points out that even though Algiers had declared war on the United States 2 years earlier, President Madison still felt constitutionally obligated to ask Congress for authorization to take offensive military action in response. So really, really big deal here. His special message to Congress was February 23rd, 1815. So we're getting close to 3 years before he even asked for permission. And this is kind of a long piece, but I think it's important. It's most of it. Congress will have seen by the communication from this is again, February 23rd, 1815. And he's pointing out something that happened back in 1812. Congress will have seen by the communication from the Consul General of the United States at Algiers, laid before them on the 17th of November, 1812. The guy basically reported what was going on months before that. They declared war, kicked everybody out, and this is a bad situation. And then this information months later was passed on to Congress in November of 1812. He said the hostile proceedings of the day against that functionary. These have been followed by acts of more overt and direct warfare against the citizens of the United States trading in the Mediterranean. So he's pointing out, hey, you guys have the documents here. They declared war on us in 1812, and then they acted on it. They've been attacking our ships, attacking our citizens. And he said, some of whom are still detained in captivity. So it is almost 3 years later, and they're still detained. Of course, they were occupied with a pretty powerful Great Britain, so they couldn't deal with a multi-front situation probably at that time. He said, some of whom are still detained in captivity, notwithstanding the attempts which have made to ransom them, and are treated with the rigor usual on the coast of Barbary. No kidding. He said, I recommend to Congress the expediency of an act declaring the existence of a state of war between the United States and the Dey and Regency of Algiers, and of such provisions as may be requisite for a vigorous prosecution of it to a successful issue. And so it just like 2 weeks later, this is March 3rd, 1815, Congress responded authorizing the president to wage a kind of a limited warfare, a limited naval warfare only by equipping, manning, and employing, quote, such of the armed vessels of the United States as may be judged requisite by the President of the United States for protecting effectually the commerce and seamen thereof on the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean, and adjoining seas. It was called an Act for the Protection of the Commerce of the United States against the Algerine cruisers. This is a specific act that was passed that went into some detail of what the president was authorized to do. Even so, it was a much more limited response than what he had asked for against Britain. Against Great Britain, he asked for a declaration of war, which basically he was authorized to command all the forces of the United States. Here, they gave him much more limited authority, even though he asked for a declaration of a state of war. He probably wanted much more power on this one as well, but didn't get it. But Mike points out that as he had during the War of 1812, Madison deferred to Congress, even though from Algiers' perspective, there already was a state of war between her and the United States. Nevertheless, Madison believed that it was up to Congress to decide whether or not the U.S. would respond. Of course, because, again, if the people of the several states, if the representatives of the people and the representatives of the states decide, no, we don't want to respond for whatever reason, we can't afford it, we aren't strong enough, maybe we're like, whatever reason, that they have. It's up to them. It is, again, there is not in any case does the executive branch get to make that decision. So 2 weeks later, after asking against Algiers, then he got his authorization to do at least a little bit. And I think that's the essential point. According to the father of the Constitution, decisions about war have to be made by the representatives of the people and the representatives of the states, not left to the whim of a single individual. I know you keep hearing me say that, but no one follows that setup under the Constitution. No one follows James Madison's approach, and no one seems to even know this history at all. And if you think about it, leaving that decision to a single person means the people of the several states are not in charge of their own fate. They are not the fountain of all power. If left to his sole discretion, if you think about it as well, a president may decide to not respond to aggression when the people and the states want him to, and vice versa. And Mike Meharry sums it up like this. Let me see if I can pull this up. He said, Madison's words and actions as president, Madison's words prior and then his actions as president really followed exactly what he had said a number of years earlier. But they underscore the original understanding of presidential war powers, that the executive has no right in any case to decide the question of war and peace. And Mike points out that it's a far cry from the nearly unlimited blanket authority to wage war that presidents claim the power to have today. Now, I don't know about you, but I never heard a single word about any of this stuff, none of it, when I went to government-run school. I mean, I'm sure it's much worse today, and I'm pretty confident they don't teach it to anybody today, because if they do, well, it changes the entire structure of how people look to executive power under the Constitution. And that's why we work hard every single day to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles under the Constitution, about the views of the father of the Constitution. We also have episodes discussing this, which I hope we'll get linked to in the show notes, discussing how George Washington addressed this, how Thomas Jefferson did against the Barbary pirates, and we'll do another episode on this on John Adams and the so-called quasi-war as well, all following the same approach that James Madison discussed and put into practice as president here today. Anyways, that I discussed here today. Anyways, you can help us reach and teach more people by becoming a member for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. So if you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. I'd be extremely grateful to any consideration you can give to joining us today. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And I want to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members lately. There's Rich in New York, William, also in New York, Gina in Florida, Casey in North Carolina, and David in Oregon. I'm so grateful for you putting your financial faith behind our work. Again, you can join them as well at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this information as much as I enjoyed putting it together for you. I hope you made you think. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything, of course. And of course, I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.